Hi there everyone. Welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Cydia Hartman and Deloria Jr. on the issue of colonialism. I was interested in having us discuss this topic for our last week in class together because I think it touches on a really difficult moral problem that I think is worthy of our collective consideration, but that is nonetheless very difficult to formulate anything in the way of a clear or straightforward solution. Both of the readings that we are dealing with this week deal with certain aspects of American history. In particular, the Hartman piece, Venus in Two Acts, concerns American slavery, chattel slavery, the Middle Passage, and how that reflects the way that we should think about the American project. And similarly, Deloria Jr. writes about philosophy in the tribal people of the indigenous North America. And specifically, in both cases, both thinkers that we are examining for this week think about how our ability to write history is in a way constrained by the historical event of colonialism and genocide. And to get a sense of this, we should pay attention to the fact that when we use the word history, we tend to mean two different things by this word that are importantly related with one another. So we think, for example, that history is historical events that have occurred within the past. But we also think about history as the act of recording such events, right? When you're in history class, part of what you're doing is you're learning about, the events that have occurred in the past, and you're also learning about who and in what circumstances those events were ever recorded. It's for this reason that many figures in the Western philosophical tradition associate the idea of history also with the idea of writing in the written word. There may be historical events without a record of the historical events. However, they are, for exactly that reason, lost to us. There are many things that we will never know in the history of philosophy. For example, one of my favorite ancient Greek philosophers, Epicurus, supposedly wrote an enormous book on nature. And all that we have left are 3 small fragments. This is the case for all sorts of sources in the history of philosophy, where sometimes historical records are destroyed and that we have only partially preserved fragments, say, of an author's writings. Obviously, we can't study a philosopher or a thinker or an idea if we don't have any record of what it is that they actually thought. And so Hartman's piece, to begin with Hartman, is a sort of critical reflection on this relationship about how history is both the historical events, but also that our only means of understanding those historical events come from the historical records that are created and preserved in a particular period of time. In Hartman, in the article we read, Venus in Two Acts, essentially concerned with narrating the story of Venus in the piece. Now, it turns out that on Hartman's account, Venus, which is often used as a sort of generic pet name, condescendingly or otherwise, for black women, it actually describes the situation of all black women. So in other words, Hartman positions the piece as an investigation of a particular person, but exactly in virtue of the fact that we don't know anything about this person in particular, it may as well have been anyone else in an analogous situation. And Hartman describes in really brutal and graphic detail what the historical record is like for enslaved people in the United States, and in particular also the process of the Middle Passage, the transference of slaves from Africa into the United States. And to illustrate her point, she just goes through the various ways in which, this historical person, Venus, that she's identifying, has been written about. There are court records, for example, of the captain of the ship tossing her overboard. So she's, brought up as a victim in illegal proceedings extremely briefly, but of course no significant consequence comes from this. She is described as debris sometimes unloaded from the ships. She is described as a sex object for her captors. So in other words, if our understanding of the history is really intimately related with the historical record that is available to us, what this means is that the story of Venus is lost to us, at least in all of its significant ways. We don't know anything about Venus's personal life, her thoughts, her desires, her intimate life. We know her only through the description that's given to her by others, by a racist society that would capture and enslave her. And of course, this situation of a specific Venus is the situation of all black women in the Middle Passage. For, as Saidiya Hartman remarked, there's not one extant autobiographical narrative of a female captive who survived the Middle Passage. And so part of the problem that's faced by Hartman is that Hartman is interested in history as a liberatory tool. The interest of history is not just the ever greater accumulation of more detailed historical knowledge, but to make a certain kind of intervention to show us who we are because of who we were and perhaps have been. And so Hartman is interested not in the accumulation of knowledge per se, but as history as a kind of practice of freedom through an examination of, the perspective of the downtrodden. But the fundamental problem in this case is that if we take history to be both the historical events and the recordings, contemporaneous recordings, then there is no history for Venus. There is at least no liberatory, emancipatory history, a history that could play a role not just in the development of knowledge for academics, but for freedom, for understanding Black history. Hartman faces this problem as a really, really serious historian, both of the Middle Passage, but also early American slavery, right? So this is really intimate, personal sort of problem for her in a sense, right? She wants to figure out how it is that her role as a historian can not participate in what Hartman calls the violence of the archive, right? The way that the historical records have come to describe Venus in an objectified and inhuman kind of manner. So we can't write the kind of history about Venus that would be liberating. We can't write the story about Venus's inner life exactly because the records of such an inner life are lost to us. And that, I think, in one way illuminates the how extremely damaging this is, right? So Hartman's solution that she arrives to is, in a way, to break with history, to start to go beyond the confines of history, and begin to tell narratives and stories about Black women's lives that are not strictly available to us with regard to the historical evidence. And so we can say that the ethical problem faced by Saidiya Hartman is something like, well, how do we write a genuinely liberatory American history? How do we write, for example, about captives in the Middle Passage without recapitulating the fundamentally racist and white supremacist depiction of them as mere property and objects? And Hartman's solution involves, in a way, having to simply break with history entirely. And so this is a really interesting and provocative response to what is, I think, a very deep, you could say, historiographical problem, which just means it relates to the writing of history. With that, let's move on to the Deloria Jr. piece. This piece is really interesting because Deloria is trying to write about the philosophy of tribal people, of indigenous Native Americans. And in particular, he ends up writing less about necessarily the contents of those beliefs, so much as the difficulties that both he and anyone else would also have in ascertaining what such tribal philosophies could be. And I think at least part of Deloria's argument is that tribal philosophy is fundamentally inaccessible to us. And this applies just as much to white people as contemporary Native American thinkers and philosophers. Deloria Jr. is obviously a Native American philosopher himself. So, that's a rather striking claim. That's very controversial, and certainly some people would ultimately end up disagreeing with him. But the claim that Deloria makes is that the genocide of Native American people that was a central component of the history of the United States has made it so that we are now in our contemporary position very, very disconnected from anything like, a primary source or something like that we can think to be adequately representative of tribal philosophy. Moreover, obviously I think that it's true that, tribal peoples thought philosophically. Everyone thought philosophically insofar as they had some conception of the world and our place within it. However, the conventions under which, the sort of Western tradition thinks about philosophy does not really always adequately describe non-Western traditions of philosophy. So, for example, philosophy in the West is often based on a very rigid distinction between religion and theology on the one hand and philosophy on the other. The Western tradition conceives of these as two separate traditions that are interrelated in interesting, important ways. But part of the way that Western tradition defines philosophy is that it is no longer religious. It is no longer symbolic or mystical or something to that effect. And so, obviously, Western interpreters of tribal ways of thinking approach it from their own perspective of what philosophy is and what philosophy should do, and that leads to them not being able to recognize the philosophy of tribal peoples. And this has been true not only in North America, but all across the globe. One of my teachers, for example, focuses on Zen Buddhism, and he was told, simply because Buddhism is a religion, that what he was doing was not genuinely philosophical. So this kind of racism persists, right? It's a kind of racism that comes from looking at, other cultures and examining them from a chauvinistic kind of point of view, right? And so what Deloria Jr. is going to say is that, okay, yeah, there wasn't like institutions of philosophy as distinct from religion and broader, theological conceptions of the world. But there was a way of thinking and ideas that were spread orally within these tribal communities, but that these traditions are essentially lost to us. That we have only very, very indirect and contentious reports about these beliefs, but we do not have, anything like a central text or figure or canon or doctrine or anything of that sort. It's not only that the Americas were colonized, it's not only that Native American people across the continent were victims of genocide. It's also that part of that genocide led to a rabid movement, an attempt to assimilate indigenous Native Americans into, sort of respectable white society or something like that, right? So Deloria Jr. describes, for example, missions, right? And this is a big part of the history, for example, of California. Essentially re-education camps that were extraordinarily abusive, set up by the church and by generally white people in order to, supposedly discipline or civilize Native American people, which meant, first and foremost, the elimination of their culture and way of life. Right? So it's not only that there's a huge amount of people dead, it's not only that huge groups of people were broken up and moved from this place to that and so on. It's also that the United States has contained institutions that were essentially set up for the integration and assimilation of Native American people that was premised on the elimination of their cultural identity and practices. And so consequently, Deloria thinks, even those who, are on reservations really only have an indirect relationship with older tribal practices than the early 20th century, 19th century, right? But nevertheless, even if we only have indirect and somewhat obscure, vague characterizations of Native American thinking, of course, something of Native American thinking, Native American culture continues to persist, right? And here, Deloria is somewhat brief, but intends to articulate some fundamental differences that he identifies between Western and indigenous Native American thinking. And that is that Western thinking is quintessentially rational. It's based on syllogistic inferences. So in other words, the focus is, what can I know for sure? What can I be absolutely certain of? How can I reason almost like how mathematicians reason and arrive at an absolutely unshakable, certain kind of conclusion, right? And for Deloria, Native American thinking is instead characterized by an integrated, relational, and ecological approach. One way to think about it is that Western philosophy, on Deloria's account, wants to analyze things. It wants to break things down and further and further and further and further and further. And that's how a lot of Western philosophy works, is they want to get to a complete taxonomy of all of the basic stuff. And so you have these huge analyses of concepts, right, that form these like weird cascading systems. But instead, rather than kind of focusing on linear way of thinking, Native American thinking is instead holistic, right? Deloria Jr. describes Native American thinking as more likely to think in terms of ecosystems, wholes, nature, rather than the individual components that make up those groups, and seeing those as fundamental, the groups rather than the individuals, the relations between people rather than their own isolated individual kinds of qualities, which is what you would arrive at if you analyzed them. And Deloria thinks that in appreciation of, Indigenous Native American thinking is necessary to the development of what he calls global philosophy, right? A kind of philosophy that's not just the provincial philosophy of this group or that group, but instead the philosophical outlook of all of humankind. And the key question is, given our history, how is that even possible, right? What should we as philosophers or as ethicists or as thinkers today think about and understand this history and respond to it ethically? We're going to end the video there, but I just wanted to take a moment to thank you so much for your participation in this course. I very much enjoyed reading your discussion posts for each week, and I hope that you found at least some of these videos helpful for philosophizing on your own some of the time. With that, I'll leave you, and thanks again for tuning in. Bye.